Great evening, Beachies. Tonight we're going to take the pulse of Norfolk with our special guest, Michael J. Muhammad. Our intro tonight is going to be the usual Beach Brothers show, so make sure you start watching now so you can learn as much as you can regarding Norfolk tonight.
So look, the Beach Brothers Show is a show where we deal with Virginia business and politics.
Well, I'm Conrad Chesviner. I'm a Hampton Roads political activist. The best ideas for community improvement happen to drive me.
I help folks that are approaching retirement and in their retirement years.
I have what I call the empowerment agenda, and that means that everything I do is focused on empowerment. You want to give a salute to Tally and Twine. It's time for you to have a high quality watch made in Virginia, made in Portsmouth, Virginia, from Tally and Twine. We want to say thanks to Southern Volkswagen Greenbrier for their great level of sponsorship. If you need a new car, you don't need to go far. Southern Volkswagen Greenbrier. And ladies, if you want your brows to say, wow, check out IamLitaWee.com. Microblading by IamLitaWee.com. I'm Seiko Varner. I do credit fixes, tax resolutions. I lend private money to real estate investors, and we do debt consolidations. If you need any of these services, contact me as provided. And now it's time to get beachy on the Beach Brothers Show.
All right, now I beg your patience tonight because I'm upstairs in my loft as I do these shows, but downstairs is a gaming night. So you might hear some loud noises from downstairs from other adults, but this is going to be a great show. And let's get ready for the podium tonight. Now, a little while ago, friend of the Beach Brothers show, and Virginia Beach Councilwoman Jessica Abbott stepped down for personal and family reasons. It is now time for the city to seriously consider her replacement. And recently, judges have found there will be no 2021 special election for her seat. So the appointee council will pick to fill Kempsville's seat will be on without election for a while. And the city will decide from 9 submitted candidate names. And here they are: Mike Anderson, Bill Dale, Naomi Esteris, Michael Feggins, Rocky Holcomb, Richard Jordan, Brian Matney, Amelia Ross Hammond, and Brent Wehrling. Now, those are some notable names, like Dr. Hammond, who served in Kempsville's seat until Jessica Abbott defeated her in 2016. Rocky Holcomb, who is a longtime Virginia Beach policeman and former delegate in the State House. Bill Dale last year ran for the Kempsville seat before being defeated by Jessica. I believe, like in years past, there'll be a public comment period for Virginia Beach citizens to go to council and address them on who they suggest council should appoint. It might be around the August 10th time period. To each of these names, look to the Beach Brothers show, as we may organize a Kempsville forum to help the public understand you all better. Just message me, Conrad Chesviner, and we'll begin to set it up. Also, Virginia Beach citizens of the city will have 2 upcoming dates at 6 p.m. to have public comment on civilian review boards. I'll be there to speak in support of strong CRBs. Those dates are August 9th and August 16th, and they're at council chambers. Be ready. And that's my podium for tonight. Now, tonight's Beach Brothers show guest is a Norfolk staple. He's a father. He's a community activist. He's a role model. He's a policy molder, and we'll touch on that in a second. And he's willing to speak to the powers that be with the voice of the powerless. He's Michael J. Muhammad, and let me bring him onto the show tonight. Thanks for joining us. And my first question is, of course, how are you, sir?
I'm well, thank you, sir. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Now, let's get right out of the gate swinging. The current Super Ward 7 rep was recently appointed by Norfolk City Council. With COVID and statewide elections, there's a likelihood that many might not know the goings on there. So break it down for us, if you will. How did we get to this point for Norfolk Super Ward 7?
Very good. Thank you for your question. Norfolk's super ward, if I may digress for a second, to address the ward system in and of itself. As you all there in Virginia Beach are in discussions to undertake the possibility of implementing a ward system. Back in 1982, Attorney James Gay filed a lawsuit on behalf of the lead plaintiff, Mr. Herbert M. Collins, declaring, or I should say stating, that Norfolk's at-large electoral system was racist and it should be declared unlawful and unconstitutional because it provided representation without, or I should say, the people were taxed without representation, because ultimately within the context of the at-large system, the white West Side power structure was able to influence, finance, and take control of the city. So after 1982 and the matriculation of the suit through the courts, in 1989, the State Court of Appeals ruled in favor of the plaintiffs and ruled that the ward system, or I should say that the at-large system, was illegal and a district system should be implemented. That was appealed by the city of Norfolk, then led by Mayor Joe Leaf, and many of the powers that be today in retired life from municipal life are those who were a part of that council. And so they fought the black plaintiffs who called this racist and unconstitutional and illegal, and they hired famed attorney Ken Starr to defend Norfolk, who would later go on to prosecute President Bill Clinton. But James Gay, Herbert Collins, and others were successful in getting the Court of Appeals to side with them. In 1990, on the appeal, the Supreme Court ruled, or decided, I should say, not to hear the case, thereby cementing the Court of Appeals ruling, and district court or district had to be set up for voting as opposed to the at-large system. When that system was set up, a two-representative system was established. That two-representative system allowed for each citizen to choose from a ward representative and what would ultimately become a super ward representative. So Norfolk is broken down into 5 wards, wards 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, which are split along racial lines, racial and economic lines, and you have out of wards 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, the division of the city in 2. You have Super Ward 6, which covers white and affluent areas, and then you have Super Ward 7 that covers all of the black industrial and commercial areas of the city. And so within that scope, you have, based on the court ruling, there was at that time a 7-member council, and they determined that 3 of the districts should be African American represented because they had over 60% African American representation at that time in Ward 7. And so wards 3, wards 4, and Super Ward 7 were identified as the majority black wards that would have black representation based on the court ruling. How we got here is greed. I'll just call it simple and plain, sir. We got here because we had members of council who knew through conspiratorial conversation with those who had ascended to, from legislator to the bench. The Judge Lindsay, who ascended from the Virginia legislator to the bench, it had already been known that they were endorsing and supporting Miss Angela Williams for his vacated seat. So knowing that she was planning to run for that state seat, she still opted to run for the councilmatic seat in May of 2020. During the height of the pandemic, where people were not attentive and the votes were cast, she was elected. She served from March until January, when she took in on a special election and went into the legislature, leaving a vacated seat. In the vacancy, the council allegedly, and we put an emphasis on allegedly because there's question as to how the process actually unfolded. But the council took interviews. Amongst the few interviews that they took was Miss Danica Royster. From those interviews, she was selected, and then by the 7 members that remained, she was elected to serve out the term of Miss Angela Williams until such time as a special election would be chosen. And now here we are at that special election. I'm losing you, sir.
Let me unmute
Nah.
myself.
Here we are, man. Here we are. We're at that special election, and it's an interesting situation because I'm looking at there's a lot of people running for that same seat. A lot of people running. Aren't there 6 candidates for that seat, Super Ward 7?
There's 6 candidates for Super Ward 7. That's correct. And that's interesting because in the appointment of the special placeholder, she was popularly elected by Ward 6. So it's interesting that now we find 6 people in a race that was ultimately put in place by the choosing of 4 members of Ward 6 that chose the Ward 7 representative. And if you don't understand what I mean by that, the constitutionality of her appointment should be challenged on the basis of the court order that said that the district should be chosen, or the district should be established so that the voters can choose their own representative. Well, even in the case of a special appointment, the problem we have with that is this. If the majority white vote of the west side of Norfolk was so problematic that the courts, all the way up to the Court of Appeals and then the U.S. Supreme Court, decided that something had to be done, how do we then take a backdoor caveat to come into the process by allowing the same power structure that the court voted down to now make appointment, which is no different than what we had before? So we have 7 members of the Norfolk City Council, 3 of which live in Ward 7. We have the mayor who lives in Poplar Halls. We have Mr. Riddick who lives in Huntersville, and we have Miss Mamie Johnson who lives in Broad Creek. Those persons live in Ward 7. But then you have Miss Courtney Doyle, you have Mr. Martin Thomas, you have Mr. Tommy Smeagol, and then you have Miss Andrea McClellan, who is the Ward 6 representative. And those 4 persons live in Ward 6. So as you all move towards studying your system in Virginia Beach, you have to make sure that they can't backdoor to overthrow and overturn what the voters and the courts have determined, because that's what they've done. We have an elected representative in Ms. Danica Royster. You say appointed, I say elected, because after she was selected, 7 members of our elected body voted for her, thus making her an elected member of council, elected by members of a community that could not even vote for her in a general election.
Interesting. Now, that is a very authoritative breakdown of how we got to this point with Super Ward 7. Let's get going on more about you regarding politics. And in terms of community activism per se, education and your political spirit, sort of break us down more about yourself and how you see yourself in politics.
A very good question. Thank you. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about myself. The problems are so multiplicit in the landscape that to give introspective thought of self would be arrogant and it would be selfish. But when it comes to my work, it has been a selfless work, a tireless work that has spanned nearly 30 years. Since I was 14 years old, my first engagement in public life was leading a school-wide walkout at Booker T. Washington High School, where I was a student. And from that time to this, they're making notes that I didn't even read, I'm sorry. But from that time to this, I've been active and engaged in community in a full-flung manner. I have not stopped. Seiko, who I've known for nearly 30 years, can vouch that I have sincerely committed myself to the service of the downtrodden of humanity. I tend to tell people that my core study is humanity, but I have a centralized focus on Black people from whom I derive. And because the problematic landscape of Ward 7, where I'm running and where I live and have lived my entire life, is really a problem that faces majority African American people. We need a strong Black representative to speak the issues of the people from the heart, from the condition and the experience of the people. And while we have 6 candidates in the race, none can compare to my track record of work, none can compare to my service record, and none can compare to the level of commitment that we have given in addressing the crises that Norfolk has been under from the time that I entered into the landscape until this.
All right. Hey, we have one of our viewers who typed in with a really great question. Salute, Michelle. Civil disobedience is a learned skill in her mind. Were you raised in a home that questioned authority? And that's a really interesting question. I kind of want to follow that up. Civil disobedience is a learned skill. Were you raised in a home that questioned authority? Because I want to take it a little step further. Were you raised in a household that said that the status quo needs to change?
No. I was raised in a home primarily by my father that was very disciplined. And my father, while a very disciplined man, was a man that was made with such wisdom that he allowed his sons to be themselves. And so while the challenge of the status quo was not the teaching, what was the teaching was you have to be true to yourself. And so as I developed my voice, while many attempted to suppress my voice, my home was very supportive in the fact that no matter how loud I became, my father would open a window if necessary so as not to stifle the sound.
Let me unmute myself. I want to switch it back to Super Ward 7 here for just a second. I want to know what is special about Super Ward 7. What are your favorite places to go, businesses to go to? What is it about Super Ward 7 that is just so great?
What is special about Super Ward 7 is so vast that I couldn't begin to address it. But I will say this, before we go to the positives, I would be remiss if I didn't address one of the primary focal reasons in Ward 7 why I'm running. I'm running because in Ward 7, in the month of July, we had more burials than we had businesses open. We had over a dozen children shot in the streets of Norfolk. That didn't happen in a vacuum. So I understand that you asked me about the pleasantries of Norfolk, but I would really feel detached from my sincerity to focus on pleasantries when there's so many fires. Norfolk is a city in crisis, and I'm a crisis manager. That's why I'm running. From police shootings to wrongful deaths to people being homeless to the Ashanti Alert and many, many other issues that I've been blessed to help to serve and to write legislation and forward legislation on. The crises are so many that we need someone who's able to focus away from anxiety, away from fear and depression, and get themselves in the fight for the liberation of the people of Ward 7 who are faced with poverty, death at their door. All of the wealthy upheaval of Ward 7, because Norfolk having a $1.56 billion annual economy, the majority of that is derived from Ward 7. But Ward 7 is the most impoverished and degraded of all of Norfolk. So when you think of downtown Norfolk, you think of Ward 6. When you think of Ghent, you think of Ward 6. Old Dominion University, the Naval Base, all of that is Ward 6. Ocean View, Ward 6. But when you go to the 50-block radius of the Norfolk City Jail that is responsible for 90% of its inhabitants, that's Ward 7. So there is much beauty in Ward 7. Ward 7 is Norfolk from one end of Military Highway to another, with the exception of Portsmouth. Because of the Ward 6 entrance of the tunnels, there is no entrance to any of the other neighboring cities except Ward 7. Our Virginia Beach neighbors, Ward 7. So Ward 7 has all that it needs. The airport, Ward 7. The Amtrak, Ward 7. All of those things that you find joy and excitement in, you'll find in Ward 7, except happiness and laughter.
Wow. So going along with that, Michelle comes with another great question, which is a question I wanted to ask. I was just in Booker T. Washington teaching last week. I love Booker T. Washington. My family grew up in that area. The family that, was from Virginia, which is primarily my wife's side. I know a lot of great Bookers. I was the access advisor at Booker T. Washington High School for about 3 years. So, I'm a Booker in the heart as well. How would you approach, as you are as well, salute that. How would you approach both civilian and police violence in Norfolk? And what do you think perpetuates? What do you think perpetuates that cycle? So how would you approach, we do have issues with the overreaching of police force, and we also have crime in our cities. And I know that too often people want to connect the two, but it comes down to they're both tragedies. How do you address that as one person in one seat on one city council?
Very good. My track record is that I am the foremost voice on police brutality and police murder in Southeast Virginia and possibly Virginia. None have stood with more families and achieved more monumental victories in that area. In 2008, from 2008 to 2016, pardon me, it was determined that over 100 people had been shot and killed in the state of Virginia at the hands of the police. There was only one city in the state of Virginia that had double-digit numbers in that 8-year period, and that was Norfolk, Virginia. I worked very closely with the previous council and then the incoming mayor, Mr. Kenneth Cooper, to address this issue in such a way that we were able to convince them and understand to them that having the Norfolk police investigate themselves at the time of a police-involved shooting caused so many problems that it had to be done away with. And so we went away from having double-digit homicides at the hands of the police of citizens to having nearly no police involved shootings involving citizens when we took the process away from the Norfolk police investigating themselves and gave it to the state police investigative body. That in and of itself should have been investigated, because ultimately it showed that there was a problem with cover-ups. So we have been very successful in addressing those issues. We also have been very successful in putting together programmatic strategies that are beneficial to the city. Norfolk has operated out of the blueprint written by myself for a long time. Unfortunately, they have not connected to the source, so they only had a part. So when you saw the 501 Fades program with the police department, it was a failure. When you saw the Nighthawk basketball program brought by Mr. Kenneth Cooper, Mayor Kenneth Cooper, it was a failure. Why? Because it had no community engagement. We have, I and my campaign, the most connection to community in the entirety of the city of Norfolk, not just Ward 7, but through and through. And from that perspective, it becomes incumbent upon us to work with the police to have a better understanding of the police and how of the community and how we can work in concert. So what we're proposing is that we establish a better system of engagement and addressing these issues through taking resources that are being misused in the municipal square and dedicating them to establishing what we're calling barbershop aesthetic improvement grants. And through those barbershop and beauty salon aesthetic improvement grants, we want to engage the barber and beauty salons in Ward 7 in training to become conflict mediation and resolution centers, so that these conflicts that exist in community and cause so much intrusion and involvement with police can be alleviated through the engagement with those who are trusted persons in the community and have relationship. Within the Black community, we all know that the barbershop and the beauty salon is our country club. So the credibility that goes with stylists and barbers and those who work in that atmosphere is tremendous. If we can engage them and resource them to turn their operations into community service tools to give back to the community in the way of conflict mediation, we believe that we can alleviate the need for the calling of the police, particularly in Norfolk. When you call, you get put on hold for over 2 minutes before there's an answer, because we're nearly 200 police officer positions deficient.
That's rather fascinating, the idea that we want to help secure greater strength in our financial community. That might help bring down some violence. And I'm curious if you just mentioned a couple good ideas regarding economic plans. Are there other ways that you would be going to get the economy moving in a way that includes the ignored members of society?
Yes, the first thing I would like to do is address with our council the $74 million debt service that we're currently under. After $1.2 billion plus was extracted by the previous administration from Norfolk's coffers and given to wealthy developers, primarily wealthy white developers, we're now staggered under a $74 million annual debt service. That is an interest-only debt service. And that debt service continues until 2025. That leaves Norfolk without the resources necessary to do any development itself. So it's strictly dependent on federal government, state government, or individual independent developers. If we were to really stop playing the numbers game and stop playing for a AAA credit rating, which really doesn't mean too much when you're self-financed in most of your projects, we could take a hit to that credit rating for a period of time to reallocate that $74 million that has been extracted from various portions of the budget back to the budget. For instance, our roads, you talk about economic development. It's difficult to develop economically when the people can't travel safely. Our roads are raggedy. Our roads have potholes the size of craters. There are jokes made that said, Norfolk, you hit a pothole in Norfolk, it'll change your radio station, your mind, and your attitude. That's how deep our potholes are. And that's because VDOT gives us over $25.4 million annually for our per inch curvature expenditure, but we take 11.16 million out of that number and allocate it to other areas of shortfall caused by tremendous debt service. 74 million is more than we have spent on many of the projects that need attention. We spent 120 million on 5 schools, but yet we're spending 74 million annually on debt service. That's real money. That's nearly $500 million in the time of this current mayor's administration. 500 million out of the public's coffers. So economic development starts with good management, not with book cooking management that gives you a triple credit, A credit rating, while yet we're going into the gutter. We're talking about the good management that addresses the issues up front and realigns itself so that we can present at a later date in a better position.
Really good work. Good work. Now, there are more than a couple times I go from the Norfolk State area toward the food line on North Military Highway near what is now a vacant Kmart. By the way, I get there in my 2017 Jetta. I got that from Southern Volkswagen on 1248 South Military Highway. And with the looming shortage of new cars because of reduced computer chips, used cars may be a hot market. So go in, see Charlie Roy, and get yourself a quality used Volkswagen, the kind you can drive from NSU to the Norview area of Norfolk very quickly. Now, even if I pass it quickly, you'll note that there's a sign that mentions the Azalea Garden athletic fields. Could you tell us a little bit more about what's going on with those? I've heard those in the news. Touch on Azalea Garden athletic fields.
Yeah. First of all, as you travel through Norview, I want you to be careful, because just a few hours ago, as we were preparing for this interview, which is one of the reasons we had to delay, there were so many gunshots fired that people literally thought that there was a all-out shootout. And so people began to take cover and go into crisis mode. And so we were addressing that in the Norview area. And I thought it necessary to mention that, because while we're talking about the Azalea Little League field, that is a place where children can go and be safe and be encouraged and be spirited with athleticism and team spirit. But unfortunately, in the Norview community, the children have very few things to do because of all our community centers being closed. So when you hear those gunshots ring out in the middle of the afternoon, in the middle of the summer, the fearful aspect of that is that one of our children will be shot. Now, moving on to the Azalea Little League field, the unfortunate reality is that our municipal government in its current structure does not respect our civic leagues and our community organizations. And so they have taken the relationship with developers and other business interests who seek to upheaval themselves off of the public purse and the public landscape. They have engaged them without engaging community. They've done it in Poplar Halls, they've done it in the eastern section of Norfolk, and they've done it in Azalea. So now the people who are talking about with the city purchasing the Azalea field and making it a sports complex, the concern of the people of Azalea is that they would be subject to treatment that is different than what they have become accustomed to, as they have worked on that field for over 50 years. And so from that perspective, we're standing fully in support of the people of the Azalea community, the people representing the Azalea Little League field, against any developer that would come in and develop that property absent the engagement of those fine people who work with our young people and prepare them for greater success in life.
You mentioned developers, and I want to tie that in here because I think we may have been hearing in the news about a breeding company development out in the Poplar Hall area. What are you hearing about that? What's your greater
Did
vision, I
you say
guess,
a
for
bleeding?
development?
Did you say a bleeding company?
Breeden.
No, I was being facetious because after engaging them at the Poplar Hall Civic League meeting the other night, they were left bleeding. They came there very disrespectfully to present a proposal that had been pro- proposed in secret amongst a minority body of council to include Mayor Kenneth Cooper and Ms. Danica Royster, the appointed council person, to the exclusion of the elected ward representative, Mr. Riddick. But that group, the Brendan group, met with Mr. Mayor Cooper and with Ms. Royster, the Department of Development, and the Department of Planning, and they hatched a plan to build this massive, nearly 400 unit development on this already fractured community. This is a community of homeowners. This is a community of retirees, postal workers, teachers, bankers, all of the ilk of profession live in that community. And they are moving in their years. They've already dealt with the disrespect of the city as they've pressed for many years for a community center and they've been neglected. Now to find that a developer is brought to the table and given a carte blanche access to their community and done so in secret. So the Brendan Group themselves said that this was a secret meeting, that it was done so in a way as to keep the public out because they did not want the intrusion of potential other investors, which meant they didn't want the people to get opportunities to look at better projects. So the city council made an effort to rush a vote through that would have given the Brendan Group the zoning for that property. Well, thanks to Mr. Paul R. Riddick, the longest standing member of council, nearly 30 years, he caught it. Having been a resident of that community and owning property in that community, he caught it. And he raised the question as to why this was being pressed forward. And if you go back and look at the very sad video from that council session, Mr. Riddick actually had to cry out against Miss Mamie Johnson, Mr. Kenneth Cooper, and Miss Danica Royster because he said, this is a African American community, and I can't get one member of the African American Council to support me in protecting this community. So Mr. Riddick needs help. Mr. Riddick needs help because he's nearing the end of his tenure, 30 years. He concludes it in 2022 with retirement, November of 2022. And so the people of Ward 7, and particularly the largest body of Ward 7, the African American population, will be left without representation in the midst of an extreme crisis, not just the pandemic of the coronavirus and now the variants that are coming behind, but the onslaught of gun violence. When you know that it costs between $80,000 and $100,000 per gunshot to treat a gunshot victim at our local trauma center, and we know that our local trauma center is operating $24 million in the red as a result of this influx of gun violence, we have to do something to address this crisis. No one wants to deal with the crisis that Norfolk is under. So Norfolk has opted to go into media and hire former media personalities who know how to tell the story from both sides. And where they've told the story of the crime and violence, they've now hired persons like Miss Lori Crouch to tell a spin story on the violence. So instead of addressing the direct violence in Norfolk, which is an absolute problem that we can put our hands on and wrap our hands around, these are people we know, families we know. Hey, if you look, and I'm not being disparaging or picking or poking fun at anybody, you all there in Virginia Beach have Mr. Lewis Jones on council. He's a funeral director. But I wonder, does he bury the majority of the city dead from gun violence, as our mayor does? So when you have a mayor who builds his bottom line off of the bodies of dead black people, can you really expect that he would make an intrusive effort to stop the killing? So I'm faced with the crisis of Norfolk, Virginia, and the burden of giving myself over to service to stand in the gap between the people and a municipal government who has treated them as sheepling. I have to stand between that and give the people hope. And that's why I'm running for Ward 7 City Council.
I want to follow up on that a little bit, in knowing that I also very frequently travel roads like Corpru and East Virginia Beach Boulevard, Azalea Gardens a lot, Military Highway, the northern sections and the southern sections. Regarding gun violence itself, you have some very strong points on improving economics to help that as well. But are there any more community-based efforts regarding various groups that you might suggest other ways to help reduce gun violence, because it's that important?
Very good. In 2016, I was the driving force behind former Virginian pilot reporter Jonathan Edwards' story on guns and gangs that Norfolk Police Chief Larry Boone credits for giving him inspiration to addressing the gun violence issue. And throughout that article, there was mention of gang truce conversations and beef mediations that I and others had hosted, even having offered my life to various gangs in the city if they would come and sit down and mediate conflict between the Huntersville area and the Berkeley area, south side of our city. And while that conflict was going on, we were able to bring those young people together and bring some respite to the conflict. And initially, the city thought it had been done by the church where it was hosted, Gethsemane Baptist Church, and Reverend Dr. Kirk Houston. But Reverend Houston, being an honest man in that occasion, said to the city, I can't take credit for Michael Muhammad's work. So when the city realized that I had the engagement ability with the young people to negotiate gang truce, Mayor Kenneth Cooper and his personal attack tool against anybody and everybody opposed to his will, Mr. Adisa Muse, who has a professional title as a clerk in the Norfolk's city clerk's office, met with myself and the former city manager and others. And when we talked about how to engage and stop this gun violence, Mr. Muse said to me, Mr. Muhammad, if you can stop the violence, how do we know you're not causing it? And while that was very offensive, it showed me the mindset of those in our municipal government. They're detached from the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation is that our people are hurting. They're suffering internally. When you take the St. Paul's Quadrant area of Norfolk, which is a 200-acre parcel of downtown developmental land, one of the only cities, if not the only city in the United States of America, major city that has 200 acres of downtown developmental land, Norfolk, Virginia is that. The St. Paul's Quadrant, where poor Black people live, is that. And so if you look at the way that they have moved the people out, it was done in such a careless and callous way, it caused crisis. Norfolk is not only a city in crisis, Norfolk is a city that has a habit of recreating crisis after crisis out of its ineptness and its unwillingness to listen to the grassroots. They have a saying in Norfolk that we're a whatever works city. They're whatever works for them city. They are whatever deal works for them, whatever real estate broker works for them. Do you notice that our former councilwoman, Angela Williams, who sat in Ward 7, mimicked the process many times and talked about how she couldn't, after making votes on various projects, how she couldn't wait to now go and sell real estate in those areas? When Huntersville, they opened up 300 lots in Huntersville for sale. and basically a gentrified wholesale. And when Ms. Williams voted on the issue, she concluded her vote with a giggle saying, now I can go and sell houses. When you look at the properties that she represents in the city, and then you go to the codes department and you see that these properties have had codes issues that have been rectified without rectifying the codes, you see how people are taking personal benefit. So we have a mayor who's sucking the blood of the poor by burying our little children who are being shot in the streets like dogs because we have a 200 police department deficiency and inadequate security. Then you have a former councilwoman, now representative, who literally takes the landscape of real estate and fills her own coffers and brags and boasts about buying boats and being wealthy, not even mentioning that the woman that was appointed to represent her in her absence, Ms. Danica Royster, is a part of the group that is her landlord for her personal real estate firm. So while all of this sounds, you're saying, wait a minute, what does all of this have to do? It has a lot to do with the corrupt practices that have been implemented in Norfolk. I work to help get the current mayor elected, and I am ashamed. I am ashamed of his outcome because ultimately, while we worked from the east side, he went right to the west side. And he's giving the people and the poverty of Norfolk the boot. Did you all know up until last year that it was illegal to be poor in the city of Norfolk? That the Virginia General Assembly just outlawed in the year 2020 a law that had been on the books, the Popper law, that said that if you were poor in Norfolk, you could either be incarcerated or evicted. This is what we're dealing with. So the historical aspect of Norfolk that you want me to talk about that is so great and grand, while I know greatness of Norfolk, while I love Norfolk and I work to expose its greatness, I can't celebrate greatness in the face of so much crisis. It's just unfair.
Very deep stuff. Very powerful statements too. So I'm glad we're able to have you on tonight in order to discuss this. I have one last, more topical-based question before we close out, and that is this. In the past two federal election cycles, if you would, there's local Congress candidates who would speak on the Ashanti alert and how they had gotten it through or something like that. So what I hear is that you are the architect behind that policy. And if you could tell us more on that story, we'd love to hear that.
Not only am I the architect, and I don't rush into this question with arrogance, but I just want to be very clear. I'm very grateful and thankful for the Spirit of God that is on me, the anointing that is on me, because it allows me to go into the midst of the most life-defining crises and help bring civility. And so when then WVEC reporter Regina Mobley called me, I knew nothing about the Ashanti situation, the young lady that was missing. She said, Michael, I don't know what to do. And I prayed and asked God, if it was my child, what would I do? And she said, the only answer I could come up with is call Michael Muhammad. So she said, will you help this family? Because I had done so much to help so many others. And at Regina's request, I went and met with the family. Within 5 minutes of meeting with Miss Brandy Billy, the mother of the beautiful, now deceased Ashanti Billy, the idea of the Ashanti alert crystallized, because several years earlier in Norfolk's Ward 7 in the Berkeley section of the city, a beautiful young woman, same age as Ashanti, 19-year-old Jaquil Hollowell, went missing. And I was so distraught in attempting to help her recover, help her family recover her. I realized that there was no system to give guidance and coverage to people over the age of 18. You had the Ashanti Alert, and then having lost my grandfather, having had a grandfather who went missing and was tragically found months later, I knew that they had a silver system. But they did not have anything for that gapping group in between. So as soon as I heard Miss Billy's story, within 5 minutes, I said, we have to have an alert. And we said the Ashanti Alert. So I then called one of my longtime helpers, Miss Kim Wimbish. I called Mr. Carlos Howard and others, and we assembled and began to work over the course of a few days. Within 48 hours, we had a major rally in town center where I announced that we would be going to Scott Taylor's office. Within 72 hours, we were sitting with Congressman Scott Taylor, where I asked him to forward legislation under the banner of the Ashanti Alert. This was in September of 2018, September the 25th to be exact. And I know that because 1 year to the date we were in the Congress on the bill passage. 2 months after Scott Taylor began the process, Jay Jones was elected to the General Assembly. And as a greedy freshman wanting to make an impact because he had aspirations of running on the state level prior to his run for the General Assembly, in his greed to be recognized, he asked and he was permissioned to take the legislation to the state. We met at the Norfolk Town Points Club, and the family and I, on the day that we picked Ashanti's car up, as a matter of fact, from the federal authorities. We picked her car up from the federal authorities, and then we met with Jay Jones, and he forwarded the legislation in the state. Scott forwarded it in the federal, and then once it got through Congress and the House, we ran up against a major wall in the Senate. It was a brilliant young woman from Portsmouth, Virginia, by the name of Erin Carter, who then marshaled the forces of her organization, being an employee of Senator Mark Warner, and she brought Senator Mark Warner to the forefront because I was working very closely with Senator Blumenthal out of Connecticut. And Senator Warner did not want an outsider to have to do the lifting of Norfolk and Virginia. So Senator Warner came in as a champion in the 11th hour, and the first bill went through Senate and was voted down. And so it had to go back through the House and then back through the Senate, and we were able to clear, and it went to President Donald J. Trump's desk at 6:30 p.m. on December 31st, 2018, during the government shutdown. So that's the history of the Ashanti Alert, in short.
And I appreciate the fact that we were able to learn how it got off the ground, and you literally led the grassroots effort of that. That does mean a lot. And
not only the grassroots effort, I can't leave you there, Conrad. It wasn't just grassroots. I just told you that I led the effort through the United States Congress and the United States Senate. That's not grassroots. That's as high as it goes. These are the people that make war. We've been blessed and privileged to be able to sit amongst the highest ilk of politicians from Norfolk to Washington, and it has not changed us. We walk with the highest officials in office, in government, in various countries, and it has not changed us. But what we have always been able to do is direct policy and change in the midst of crisis. And so that's why this race is as important to us as it is, and it's really the most important race in Norfolk in a very, very long time. We changed the complexion of the mayor's office. After 300 And 34 years, we elected the first black mayor in 2016. But unfortunately, all we did was took a poison white cake and put pretty chocolate icing on it. It's still poison down to the last morsel. The people are suffering. The city is suffering. The finances, no matter what picture they paint for you, are suffering. There is no good way to service $74 million in annual debt. So the people need a champion and a crisis manager, and that's why we're running.
Facts, Miss LeBon would say. These are very deep topics, and I appreciate that you're able to bring to us um, basically yourself. And we want to learn as much about you going forward into this election as possible. So I'm glad you're able to share this with us. And there is much about your candidacy that is important beyond just all this. But we're nearing the end of the show.
Thank
So
you.
how about give us a sort of a final rundown, like an elevator pitch, I guess, if you would, on your vision and how the people can find out more about you and why you are the choice for Ward 7.
Listen, Conrad, I'm of Cuban descent. Elevator pitches don't work with us, man. No, but seriously. I've given my life to service. Not because I wanted some elevated position, but because I love people. My heart is service. My work is service. Former Congresswoman Thelma Drake, who I served in consultant capacity with at one time, said to me some very profound words that stuck with me. She said, Michael, your public service should be an outgrowth of your community service. And from that perspective, I personify that. I've served community, and now I want to take that service to a corporate level. The councilmatic body is essentially the board of directors of the multi-billion-dollar multinational company, Norfolk, Virginia. We've had a bad board. Our chairman just isn't cutting the mustard. So we need somebody who can vocalize on behalf of the poor, the downtrodden, the lost. You will find wealthy, affluent white people in the city of Norfolk supporting Michael Muhammad. Why? Because change is needed. When I have the mayor of Virginia Beach endorsement, when I have Mr. Randy Wright's endorsement, when I have the endorsement of the past and current president of the Poplar Hall Civic League, the Coronado Inglenook Civic League, and so many other organizational bodies and civic league presidents, that is a diverse body growing. When I have the endorsement of one of the most profound and prolific civil rights activists here in the state of Virginia, in Miss Patricia Turner, one of the Norfolk 17. All of those endorsements mean a lot to me. Mr. Taki over at the Azalea Inn. These diverse endorsements show that we are bringing to bear a Norfolk that none have dared to engage. The Asian American community is surrounding us. The African community from the continental perspective here in America is embracing us. So we have an engagement of a very diverse platform of people. And when we swear in, Conrad, we're going to do something that I don't believe anybody has ever done. We're not going to do a swearing in. We're going to affirm. And when we make our affirmation, we're not going to do it on my book of faith. We're going to do it on all of the monotheistic books of faith, those Abrahamic faiths. We're going to affirm on the Torah. We're going to inform on the gospel or the Injil and the Quran. We're going to place our hands there and make affirmation, because unity is the score that we're after. And as we work to bring that unity in the religious sector, in the political sector, in the gang sector, in the business sector, we will bring about what very few have ever even thought was possible. We'll bring about one Norfolk.
That is very refreshing. It's invigorating to hear that. And I want to thank you, Mr. Michael J. Muhammad. We wish you much respect and strength with peace on your 2021 journey. And again, thank you for coming on the show. It's been excellent.
Thank you. We're unbought and unbossed. Remember that.
Yes, sir. Now, that has been another great episode of the Beach Brothers Show with special guest candidate Michael J. Muhammad. And as we close out today, I want you guys to also know that we're going to do another Free Friday show tomorrow night. We're going to bring on special guest Kyle Varner, all the way from Washington State, a libertarian who is a doctor and really proficient in knowledge of COVID-19. So it's going to be a nice, lively discussion on that. And we're also going to bring in Chesapeake's Sandy Leathers for, well, joining that in because she works in the healthcare field. And I want to make sure that we all get to hear both the local, national perspective on COVID-19 regulations and why it's all important to study that. So thank you all for joining tonight. And I want to close out by having the outros for Great Mr. Beach Brothers show host Mr. Jose Cruz and Seiko Varner.
It's never too early or too late to plan for retirement. Let me show you how to protect yourself, your loved ones, and your assets from loss due to catastrophic decisions that may affect you the rest of your life. Please call me.
This show was brought to you by Positive Vibes Incorporated, our consulting services. We do credit fixes, we do tax resolution, we lend private money, and debt consolidation. So if you need some of these services, we're waiting here for you. Credit fixes, tax resolutions, private money, and debt consolidation. Make sure you call Positive Vibes Incorporated.